What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another installment of Best Armies in Warhammer 40k. This one for the weekend of February 17th and 18th, 2024. This is the weekly video series where we go through the last week's results in terms of competitive 40k, talk about the undefeated armies in large GT and major level events, and oh boy, do we have an absolute doozy of a weekend this week. We're finally seeing some big results coming out of the new competitive scene from post the January 2024 data slate. We're really getting a grip on the metagame, and we had a ton of GTs go down this weekend. Now, we actually had such a breadth of content, I am going to cut down the length of this list a little bit. I will not this week be covering lists that had a draw on their record, because we did have a lot of events with draws. We had a lot of events using a differential scoring format, which tends to create tons of draws, and including those in the data would have wildly inflated the results that we're looking at this week. But anyway, with that in mind, let's jump into the list with a metagame breakdown, starting with Adeptus Custodes, which took down no less than 4 GTs with winning records: the Warhammer 40k GT, Blue Ridge Championships, 36 Chapters GT, and Guild 2nd GT. Adepta Sororitas are nipping at their heels with 3 event wins at Masquerade 7, Wizards Asylum GT, and the Battleton and Alzheimer's. Necrons also took 2 down at the Ragnarok and Hydra GTs, as well as a couple of factions that were one-offs. Drukhari with an undefeated result at the Warhammer 40k GT, Death Guard winning the Kingston Nexus, Ultramarines also with a result from the Guild 2nd GT, and Chaos Space Marines taking down the Castle GT. Really interesting swath of results from this week. Custodes and Necrons being up at the top I don't think is too surprising to anyone. Adeptus Sororitas I don't think is too surprising. We expected to see them at the top, definitely competing with Custodes. And the other factions are cool to see. Space Marines continuing to do well. We saw some good results from Space Marines previous weeks. We are continuing to see that happen. And Chaos Space Marines back on the winning circuit after they saw enormous nerfs in the balanced data slate. So it's cool to see that they are able to recover effectively enough to win. Now let's dive into these lists, starting with Adeptus Custodes. So the Warhammer 40k Grand Tournament was one of the largest events of the weekend, and Joseph Reed took Adeptus Custodes to an undefeated record at it. Joseph was running a Blade Champion with Ceaseless Hunter, Trajan Valoris, as well as Valyrian, the half of Valyrian and Alea. Valyrian is an interesting inclusion. Not only does he give a unit he's joined into a permanent Armor of Contempt effect, reducing incoming armor penetration characteristic, but he also is himself pretty significantly powerful. He has a Master Artisan's reroll built into his own datasheet, and once per game can Strands of Fate that, turning a roll into 6 after rolling. So he himself is very consistent with a good melee profile, but he also makes his unit extremely hard to kill, which is good in a big brick of something like Custodian Wardens, which we do see in this list. This list was running 2 units of 2 Alaris Custodians alongside 2 units of 5 Custodian Guard, plus 2 units of Custodian Wardens, a unit of 5 and a unit of 4. We then had 3 Venatari Custodians, a Witch Seeker squad, as well as Kyria Draxus and a Calidus Assassin. Moving on to Adepta Sororitas, we'll talk about the Masquerade 7, where Reese Cunningham went 5-0 with the faction. Reese's list included Junith Erowita for command point generation, Morven Val, and a Palatine with the Blade of St. Eleanor. He brought a unit of 10 Battle Sisters in the battle line, equipped with a Multi-Melta and Meltagun, 1 Immolator, as well as 2 Sororitas Rhinos, 3 units of Arco-Flagellants to go in those Rhinos, and 2 units of Sisters Repentia. We are seeing a lot more inclusion of the Sisters Repentia as a little bit of an accent to the Arco-Flagellants. They are also a relatively speedy, aggressive melee unit, but they are higher AP, higher damage, rather than the high volume that the Arco-Flagellants are. The Arco-Flagellants are definitely more effective, but not against every single profile, and the Repentia can kind of shore up their weaknesses in that way. We then saw 2 Castigators in the army, both of them with battle cannons, 3 units of 2 Crusaders in order to score some delicious secondaries and generate miracle dice when they die, 2 units of 5 Seraphim for additional utility units, and 1 unit of Paragon Warsuits for Morven Val to join into. This list is focusing much more heavily on infantry than other Adeptus Sororitas lists that we've seen previously. Right now, Sisters are kind of split between either taking a list like this that's taking tons and tons of tiny independent utility units and fast melee units that are going to get up in the middle of the table, beat down one of your opponent's units, get themselves killed, generate miracle dice, and fuel the heavier units like the Paragon Warsuits. We also see some lists bringing more heavily armored armored versions that are relying on units like Castigators and Immolators and even Exorcists, although they are a little bit more expensive now. This one obviously focusing on that former archetype. And that moves us on to Necrons, our third faction with multiple undefeated results from the weekend. Necrons were able to take down the Ragnarok Winter GT, where Adam Smith took the faction to a 5-0 record. This was a Hypercrypt Legion variant of Necrons and was rocking a relatively interesting composition, including a Catan Shard of the Nightbringer and a Shard of the Void Dragon, but also a Catan Shard of the Deceiver. Now, the Deceiver is the last of the Catan Shards usually included in an army, even after Transcendent Catan, the non-character Catan Shards, mostly because he doesn't really do very much damage. He has a really interesting precision anti-character gun, which can occasionally kill a very, very low wound character, but is kind of inconsistent at doing so. He also hits pretty hard in melee, especially against heavy infantry with a high AP, 3 damage, high volume attack, but generally doesn't really shoot or punch very much better than a regular Transcendent Catan, and on top of that doesn't have its ability to teleport around the table or its built-in sustained hits. Instead, he has stealth, a higher OC value, making him better at holding down and taking objectives, and he also gives you the opportunity to redeploy units before the game starts. Of an army like this that is focusing very heavily on huge vehicles and monsters actually benefits pretty well from that Catan Shard of the Deceiver. You can place your large monsters and vehicles early on in the deployment step, and even though the Deceiver's redeployment ability doesn't occur after you determine who takes the first turn, you can see where your opponent places their own big heavy guns and manipulate your own positioning in order to pull your units out of dangerous positions, which can certainly help you not lose things to an Alpha Strike if your opponent is deploying extremely aggressively, which many players try to do in order to kill units on the table before they jump into hyperphasing, thanks to the Hypercrypt Legion detachment ability. The ability to Cosmic Precision the Catan Shard of the Deceiver into aggressive positions, steal objectives away, is also pretty good, and he is extremely good at beating down enemy utility units that are holding down objectives. If you have 5 infantry models on an objective, Deceiver will beat them. It's not a super efficient use of your points, but it's certainly not bad by any stretch of the imagination. We also then had a Hexmark Destroyer and an Overlord. That Overlord was joined into a unit of 10 Lich Guard with Hyperphase Swords and Dispersion Shields, most likely using the Hypercrypt Legion ability to jump around the table in order to deliver those guys into annoying positions and potentially into melee. We then had 3 Canoptek Scarab Swarms to perform utility, a single Canoptek Spider with a Gloom Prism, 1 unit of Death Marks, as well as Flayed Ones in order to add more utility infantry units, 2 Tomb Blades for largely the same reason. They're scouts, so they're able to move up aggressively and perform secondaries on the first turn of the game, which obviously if you go first with Hypercrypt Legion, you're not able to teleport your models around the table, meaning that the Tomb Blades themselves are pretty good at starting on the table. They can also kill enemy light screening units and make your hyperphasing easier in the future, so all good things from the Tomb Blades. But we then also had 2 Doomsday Arcs, meaning that the list was focused very heavily on scoring immense amounts of points with the massive number of utility units and forward operators that it had, but also doing damage with its 3 Catan Shards and 2 Doomsday Arcs, all of which it's able to do pretty well thanks to the ability to not only redeploy them so they don't get blown up on the first turn, but also jump them around the table as the game goes on. While we are seeing Hypercrypt Legion arise as the single best archetype in Necrons, there is a lot of flexibility in the detachment. Flexibility is sort of the name of the game for that detachment, so it is cool to see more innovation happening beyond just the single monolith list that we saw win LVO earlier this year. Moving on from there, we can talk about Drukhari. Moving back to the Warhammer 40k Grand Tournament, we saw George McCullough go undefeated with the faction, this bringing the new Sky Splinter Assault. George McCullough was running an Archon with Sadistic Fulcrum. This is a relatively inexpensive enhancement to empower a friendly Drukhari transport within 3 inches of the bearer's unit if the bearer's unit is also empowered in the shooting phase. We then also had a Beastmaster and Lilith Hesperax, not really focusing very heavily on the multiple Archon build this time around. We've seen some Sky Splinter Assault lists really trying to take lots of Archons as well as Incubi units to do lots of melee shenanigans, but not so much in this list. I think we're going to be focusing on Lilith for that. We then had a unit of 10 Kabalite Warriors, 2 units of 5 Racks, and a unit of 10 Witches. That Archon was jumping into that unit of 10 Kabalite Warriors so that they could all together jump into a Tantalus. We could then empower the unit to get their full hit and wound rerolls thanks to the Archon's ability, and after having jumped out of the Tantalus, that sadistic fulcrum allows the Tantalus to also get the benefits of that empowerment. The Tantalus is an incredibly interesting profile that we've seen off and on occasionally over the course of the edition as Drukhari lists have sort of developed. It's a large Drukhari transport with a massive firing deck of 16 that actually deals significant damage in melee, able to do some mortal wounds on the charge as a tank shock sort of equivalent. It can also use the tank shock stratagem normally and even use the Sky Splinter Assault stratagem to deal additional damage after the unit has attacked in melee as well, meaning that the Tantalus full of models can do some absolutely ludicrous numbers of mortal wounds once it gets stuck into the opponent. It also has an incredibly effective range profile, a set of pulse disintegrators firing 12 times strength 10 AP2 for 2 damage. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but it is a pretty solid profile and one that when you get a free pain token from that sadistic fulcrum feels pretty good to be firing with full rerolls. Pretty good at clearing lots of medium infantry with this guy. To complete that wombo combo, we also had a Court of the Archon to join in with that Cabalite Warrior squad, meaning that the Archon, the Court of the Archon, and the Cabalite Warriors would all be benefiting from that single pain token that would then pass on Tantalus as long as the Archon's within 3 inches of it. We had a Chronos to regenerate those pain tokens, 2 units of Grotesques, 2 units of Mandrakes for utility, a single Ravager, and 2 units of Scourges to add some additional Dark Lance shooting. Following up the dedicated transport slot, we did have 3 Raiders and 2 Venoms to attach in those Grotesques, Racks, and Witches alongside Lilith Hesperyx. Lilith Hesperyx's unit is definitely going to benefit pretty widely from the newfound buff for Drukhari units to get +1 AP when they are empowered in melee. That makes them a lot more dangerous than they were previously, where they were basically just bounce off most power armor style factions, but now can really clear out infantry of a wide variety, whereas your anti-tank is being provided by units like those Scourges and by this Tantalus combo that we just talked about. This list is super cool, very interesting, and definitely a far cry from the normal sort of Venom spam and Raider spam that we've seen Drukhari bring in the past, and that a lot of these Sky Splinter Assault lists are moving towards. This whole Tantalus combo being a central key component of the list definitely makes things a lot more interesting. And the detachment has a lot of super cool synergies with the Tantalus itself. Being able to give it a 4+ invulnerable save from Night Shield or a reactive move of 6 inches thanks to Swooping Mockery. Both of those are pretty good on a huge 18 wound transport to keep it alive and keep it out of your opponent's hands for as long as possible. And all that together makes for a very effective list. And that moves us on to Death Guard, who were able to take down the Kingston Nexus Championships, where Kevin Rutherford took the faction to an undefeated record. Kevin's list was running Mortarion and Typhus, the new staple of Death Guard armies after his points value was cut in the most recent data slate update. We saw 2 Biologus Putrefires as well as a Lord of Virulence running up the remainder of the characters in that list. 2 Plague Marine units, all dressed to the nines for those Biologus Putrefires to join into, 2 units of 5 Death Guard Cultists, and a big unit of 6 Death Shroud Terminators to attach with the Lord of Virulence. We then saw 20 Poxwalkers, potentially for Typhus to join into. He can respawn Poxwalkers when he kills people with his Psychic Power ability, which can keep the unit topped off pretty significantly. We saw that played quite often when the edition came out, less so now because I think Poxwalkers have kind of been outshone by a lot of the most recent infantry sweeping that players have been bringing into their armies, but still a pretty effective combo for not many points now that Typhus is pretty inexpensive himself. We also have a Death Guard Land Raider as well as a Death Guard Rhino, so we can carry 2 of those Plague Marine units if we so desire, alongside 2 Fetid Blow Drones to act as fast objective holders, and 3 units of the newly upcharged Nurglings to be secondary objective grabbers. Really interesting to see Death Guard evolve past the kind of samey lists that we saw from them previously, mostly focusing on Plague Marines and Plague Burst Crawlers. Now we're seeing Mortarion slowly brought back into Death Guard lists, now that his ability to ignore modifiers can ignore modifiers to your weapon characteristics, so damage reduction and AP reduction are also ignored by his ability. That's a huge deal. And being able to attach that to units like Plague Marines that, while being more expensive, were already pretty effective at dealing damage, especially with those Biologus Putrefires. And altogether, that makes for a pretty terrifying combo. Not to mention the fact that you have these powerful units like the Poxwalker Brick and the Death Shroud Terminators running around your opponent's backline and being an absolute nightmare to deal with. And that moves us on to the Guild's second GT GT, where Javier Barrera went undefeated with Ultramarines. This was a Vanguard spearhead of the variety that we've seen many times before. I have zounds of videos about this John Lennon style of Ultramarines Vanguard spearhead, and if you want to hear me talk about those, you can look elsewhere on the channel, but I will run the list down very quickly for you. It has an Apothecary Biologus with Blade Driven Deep to give his unit infiltration. He can then attach alongside Marneus Calgar, Marneus Calgar being a chapter master. Those can all attach together into a big Gravis squad. Normally we see aggressors from Marneus Calgar's ability to give them advance and charge. Right now we're going to be using his ability to give them advance and shoot by joining into a huge Eradicator squad. So an enormous amount of anti-tank shooting is going to be standing in the middle of the table with a relatively long threat range and backed up by extremely good melee from Marneus Calgar himself. We then have Uriel Ventress to grant Deep Strike to an infantry unit, which he can grant into a Centurion Devastator squad, allowing them to use the return into Deep Strike stratagem to jump into Strategic Reserve and then come back using Deep Strike and get enormously flexible lines of fire onto whatever units in your opponent's army that you really need to explode. If you Oaths of Moment the target of the Centurion Devastators, the entire unit's equipped with twin-linked glass cannons, so they're getting full hit and full wound rerolls thanks to the combination of those abilities. If you're shooting at vehicles, the Eradicators are also getting full hit and full wound rerolls, meaning that most of your army is getting full rerolls and is incredibly mobile. We then also have a Company Heroes unit for Uriel Ventress to join into because they're like pretty rad. A bunch of Inceptors, 2 units of 6 Inceptors with Plasma, as well as 1 unit of 3 with Assault Bolters to act as utility, and 2 Scout squads alongside a Calidus Assassin and a unit of Inquisitorial Henchmen. This is an infantry-focused army that's extremely focused on deep striking and doing absolutely insane amounts of damage with units like Inceptors, and all these Centurions and Gravis Armored Squad that we talked about previously that can start up the middle of the table, jump into your opponent's deployment zone, and absolutely lambast them, even if they're trying to hide as well as they can behind terrain. Oftentimes this army is going to be able to get around corners and see them. It's interesting to see Eradicators taken in this slot instead of the normally played aggressors, but if you're expecting to go into a vehicle-focused meta and you're not really sure that aggressors are going to cut it when it comes to actually punching down stuff, I think that the Eradicators definitely make sense. And with that, that brings us to our last list of the week. We see Chaos Space Marines taking down the huge Castle GT, where Jakub Jansa took the faction to a 6-0 record at this major level event. Super interesting to see a faction that we had at the top of these videos for the last couple of months relegated down to the status of having a single undefeated army. But it is cool to see the army be so flexible that it's able to move in and adopt a composition that can still go undefeated in this new season, even after receiving the enormously heavy nerfs that they saw in the data slate update. They had huge points increases across the board, transformative changes to how a lot of their units and mechanics work, and it was extremely damaging to the faction, but I think they have such a deep roster that they can still play a lot of interesting units. This list is running 2 Chaos Lords with the Marks of Chaos Undivided. Those guys have 2 units of 5 Undivided Chosen that they can join into, the classic combination that we've seen from the faction in the past. We also then have a Chaos Rhino that also has the Mark of Chaos Undivided. Unfortunately, they can no longer go into the Nurgle Rhinos to be largely immune to shooting thanks to Dark Obscuration, but they can go into the Undivided Rhino, and that turns out just fine. We then have a Sorcerer in Terminator armor, who's not bringing a unit to join into per se, but he does have Deep Strike and he is being taken as Mark of Nurgle, so he can be Dark Obscurated to grant him an effectively lone operative, even if he's by himself. He can then Deep Strike up to an enemy unit that you need to destroy, use his Death Hex, and on a 2+, increase your armor penetration characteristics by 1, targeting that unit, making the rest of your army that much more effective. We also then had a Warpsmith with Eye of Tzeentch. This guy is a classic inclusion. With that Eye of Tzeentch, he essentially has Abaddon's ability to generate UCP, so for just a relatively inexpensive character who can sit by your vehicles and not be shot to death, he can just passively generate you command points over the course of the game. And last but certainly not least, we had Harkin, World Claimer, join into a big unit of 10 Chaos Raptors. Harkin gives the Raptors a Hammer of Wrath ability, allowing them to do impact attack mortals when they charge, making the unit, in addition to being Chaos Undivided and getting wound rerolls from Profane Zeal, and just generally speaking being a relatively fast and effective melee unit, but plus the inclusion of Harkin as well, that allows the Raptors to also be effective against even enemies that normally their Chainsword and Power Fist profiles would not be able to dent. We then had 2 units of 5 Warp Talons with Mark of Slaanesh to give them access to advancing and charging, to act act as a combination of utility units and objective traders, able to jump out and grab objective holding enemy units, especially enemy utility units, and absolutely rip them apart, flip objectives in the Chaos Space Marine player's favor, alongside 2 units of 3 Nurglings to act as utility. All that was backed up by some insane shooting. We had 2 Nurgle Predator Destructors alongside a Nurgle Vindicator, as well as an Undivided Forge Fiend to again give it access to that profane zeal for wound rerolls. Definitely not as effective shooting as we've seen in the past, but we still have a lot of very effective guns, especially alongside Dark Pacts being added on top, that can use Dark Obscuration to remain largely immune to enemy shooting and be able to win gunfights with basically any faction in the game. I think a lot of Chaos Space Marine players knew that once their most powerful combos and things like their Forge Fiends got a little bit nerfed, they could probably fall back on taking their more standard armored vehicles like Vindicators and Predators, because the Dark Pact's ability allows them to shore up the weaknesses of those chassis so hard that they're able to still compete into a wide variety of profiles that they normally wouldn't be able to do so in most other Astartes style factions. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section what you thought about these lists and which ones were your favorite. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.